The idea that Christians are, by their very nature, persecuted is grounded in an inaccurate history of the early church. Christians were not relentlessly persecuted in the first few centuries, and they're not systematically and continually persecuted today. Hello, I'm Candida Moss, Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at the University of Notre Dame. Today, Christians from all denominations remain deeply invested in the myth that for the first 3 centuries of its existence, the early church was the victim of relentless persecution. But contrary to traditional church teaching and popular belief, Christians were not systematically tortured and killed by the Romans merely because they refused to deny Christ. Rather, these stories were exaggerated, revised and forged, often centuries later, and the history of the church was reshaped in order to combat heresy, to inspire and educate the faithful, and to fund churches. In addition to getting the history right, the goal of my book is to expose the dangerous legacy that these misunderstandings about Christian martyrdom have had for us today. The rhetoric of martyrdom and persecution persists, especially in the language of the religious and political right. And just as early Christians employed the martyrdom myth to exclude heretics, this very same myth is still used to silence dissent and galvanize a new generation of cultural warriors. We can see this in statements by Christian leaders, speeches by politicians, and the rhetoric of media pundits who claim that they are being persecuted in the way that Christians have always been persecuted. The idea that Christians are, by their very nature, persecuted is grounded in an inaccurate history of the early church. Christians were not relentlessly persecuted in the first few centuries, and they're not systematically and continually persecuted today.
Well, I think you've largely established that, with the exception of a couple of years, there was one emperor that you talked about. Was it Diocletian? Diocletian.
Yeah.
With the exception of that one period for a couple of years, by and large, Christians were not the victims of intense persecution in the early church. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's 2 years between 303 and 305 when the Emperor Diocletian institutes laws that really correspond to what we imagine when we think about persecution. You know, Christians being forced to sacrifice, sort of being hunted down, that the Romans were really going to make sure that they got them. But apart from that brief 2-year period, we really don't see anything much like the modern conception of persecution. Sometimes Christians died as a result of legislation that wasn't designed to target them.
But just anti-revolutionary or anti-religious?
Well, so there's an emperor called Decius, and he passed a decree that was supposed to revivify something called the Roman imperial cult. The Roman imperial cult, it stabilized the empire. It protected them from attack. It unified them. And it wasn't a religious innovation. It was much more like a pledge of allegiance.
Was this kind of a variation on Blut und Erde, the concept that Hitler was promoting? We are of this soil, we are of this race, we are therefore this nation?
Yeah, it's a little bit like that, although I'm sort of loath to bring in any comparisons to Hitler.
Yeah, it's whoever, yeah.
But what's interesting is Christian historians told us that this legislation was designed to target Christians. It was anti-Christian legislation and it was wicked. And then we discovered archaeological evidence that in fact it was just general legislation. It wasn't about the Christians. And the difference between general legislation that you don't like or you feel you can't act in accordance with, and persecution that's designed to get you, there's a difference between those things that we have to acknowledge and respect.
Yeah, it seems like a significant difference.
It is.
So if there was really in the first 300 years of the church, before the church became the state to a large extent, and held that ground until what, the Italian Revolution of the late 19th century, early 20th century. I mean, the Catholics ruled much of Europe, most of Europe. If that persecution didn't happen, why is that story so pervasive now? We touched on this earlier, but how does it get continually re-nurtured, and why?
Right, well, there are a couple of reasons. Before Jesus, persecution was not a badge of honor. It was a sign that your deity was angry, was punishing you, was impotent, couldn't support you.
Oh, this is the Old Testament notion.
Right.
You know, good God tells Joshua, go to the city of Ai, kill everybody, cut open their stomachs. But
right.
Yeah, okay.
And most everyone in the ancient world would have agreed. If you're being persecuted, you do not have divine support.
Right.
With Christianity, with Jesus dying on the cross, persecution, suffering, martyrdom, these now become sort of badges of honor. You're now like Jesus. So persecution sort of gets hardwired into the Christian psyche. Now, the reason that it stayed was because it's tremendously powerful rhetoric. So you could say at first, well, the Romans are persecuting us. But then with the rise of the Christian Empire, Christians maintained the idea that basically the world is polarized. It's us against them, and we're under attack, and we're the good guys. Except the people who are attacking us are now not the Romans, but say, you know, the Ottoman Empire or heretics in the church are attacking us just like the Romans. And once you make that claim, you can legitimate any kind of violence against those groups because you're on the defensive.
Right.
You're the one who's persecuted, and obviously you have to defend yourself. Right. This is why persecution rhetoric is so effective. The psychology of it is that this kind of persecution complex allows your group to really band together. It brings about social unity. And we can see that now when people use persecution rhetoric. It's sort of, you know, it's us, this small, tiny little group against the world that's attacking us. Right. So even if your group isn't small and isn't powerless, this idea gives your group real social cohesion. Part of it's actually in the New Testament. Jesus predicts that Christians will be persecuted. Right. And so Christians say, well, see, Jesus told us that we would be. What's interesting is that when you look at the specifics of those passages, a very different picture emerges. So in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, defend me in courtrooms, and some of you who are standing here will be alive when I return.
Right.
Now, clearly,
after one generation, that starts to
that's
go,
not true.
What?
So why is it that we subscribe to the other part of this prophecy, that we're always persecuted? It's because we think that it's been proven throughout history, particularly in that early period. But Jesus' specific prophecies weren't terribly accurate. So he says that James and John, the sons of Zebedee, would be baptized with his baptism, which is sort of a euphemism for die. But John, the son of Zebedee, is the only one of the disciples not to have been martyred. That's not a great track record for prophesying martyrdom. Now, we can read this metaphorically. We don't have to read it as a prophecy about persecution. The reason that we do is because this persecution mentality is so useful when it comes to defending our turf and sort of making claims in sort of discussions about society.